Delighted to be here to chair this meeting on unionism, Protestantism, and the national question. My name is Jennifer Todd. I've worked at UCD in Dublin for a long time, but I think I'm here partially because I was born in Belfast, grew up in Magherafelt in a Protestant and unionist family, stopped being a unionist by the age of 13, but I'm still a Protestant of some form. And I'm delighted to welcome two speakers, Bell and Gladys Ganiel. Christine is an academic, a lawyer, human rights activist, who is Professor of Law in University of Edinburgh. Earlier, she worked in Queen's and University of Ulster as barrister. And in the 1990s, she was chair of the Committee on the Administration of Justice and a founder member of NIHRC. Gladys is a sociologist at Queen's, before that at Trinity College, Dublin, and I know her from much earlier when she was doing her PhD in UCD on evangelicalism and Protestantism in the North. She has interviewed more Protestants than most of us know. And her most recent books are on Presbyterianism, the Troubles, and in the life of Father Jerry Reynolds. So I think we're going to start with Gladys, go on to Christine, about 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll move to questions and discussion. So Gladys, delighted to have you here.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. I think it'll be helpful. I just want to start by reading the event description because some of what I will say immediately follows off that description. So the event was sort of billed as until the late 19th century. It was common for unionists and Protestants of all varieties to see no problem in identifying as Irish. And the rise of Ulster unionism and partition changed this. So we wanted to ask some questions, I suppose, around that observation. So building on that, in my initial contribution, I want to make 3 points. The first is why it's so difficult for some unionists to identify as Irish. The second is about the changing role of religion and its impact on identity. And the third is about those who identify as Northern Irish or as neither unionist or nationalist. So my first point then, and that is while partition contributed to a decline in the tendency of unionists and Protestants to identify as Irish, it was really the violence of the Troubles that copper-fastened this trend. So there's an often cited pre-Troubles survey by Richard Rose from 1968, and it gives us these statistics. So at that time, among Protestants, 39% identified as British, 32% as Ulster, and 20% as Irish. But in 1989, a survey by Edward Moxon Brown gave these figures. So 68% now would have identified as British, 14% as Ulster, and just 3% as Irish. So you can see a big change there. And I tend to agree with Moxon Brown's reasoning for the stark change. And this is a quote. He said, after having borne the brunt of the IRA campaign, Protestants have swung more definitely towards adopting the label British. In other words, violence not only reflected the polarization of society, it increased it. So I think that the legacy of the IRA's violent campaign makes it very difficult for some Protestants to even contemplate identifying as Irish. So in my research, some Protestants and unionists would have told me that Republicans are engaging in what they would see as a campaign to rewrite history, and those are the words they would use, with Sinn Féin presenting themselves as civil rights campaigners and claiming that the armed struggle was morally justified. So they see no place for themselves or their story in that version of history. So from their perspective, their husbands, sons, wives, daughters were murdered, either innocently going about their daily business, or in the case of those who joined the IRC, trying to protect society from terrorism. And again, murder and terrorism is the language they would use. So for them, to identify as Irish would be to identify with perpetrators who they believe are not even sorry for those deaths. So I know today's discussion isn't about dealing with the past, but our failure to have a comprehensive, joined-up process, which gives people from all perspectives a chance to tell their story or find out what really happened, during the Troubles means that these legacy issues just continue to haunt all discussions about future political arrangements on the island. So I think there's unlikely to be any growth in affinity between unionism and Irish identity, as long as a substantial number of unionists remain convinced that, in their view, the IRA has gotten away with murder. So my second point then, that's about the close link between the Catholic Church, the Irish state, and Irish identity, especially in the decades immediately after partition. And this has been a major reason why some unionists have had problems identifying as Irish. So unionists believe that the Republic was a Catholic state, and with seemingly good cause, you might say. Catholic social teaching on matters like contraception, divorce, and abortion was for many years reflected in the laws of the Irish state. And the state seemed to give the church free rein to run entire sectors like health and education. So unionists feared that in a Catholic state, their freedom to practice their religion would be compromised. And again, fear isn't too strong a word here. If you put it in context, for centuries across Europe, it was all too common for Catholics and Protestants to violently persecute each other, especially when the other was a minority. And if you doubt the potency of this fear, I think it's worth recalling the anti-Catholic rhetoric of the Reverend Ian Paisley, and remembering that the congregation he built for himself is called Martyrs Memorial Free Presbyterian Church. And the martyrs that Paisley was referring to stretch back across centuries of Irish, British, and European history. And that church building remains a stark physical reminder of it. Protestant martyrs also feature prominently on the banners of the Orange Order in the annual parades. But since the mid-1990s, increasing secularization and the abuse scandals in the Catholic Church have meant that link between the Catholic Church, the Irish state, and Irish identity has been dramatically weakened, if not severed completely. And this has removed a major reason why some unionists might have problems identifying as Irish. So on the one hand, that might seem so obvious as hardly to merit mentioning, but it is worth mentioning, not least because I think there is a possibility at the present juncture of this island's history that churches might play a unifying rather than a divisive role in contributing to future societal arrangements. And this, as far as I can see, is historically very unusual, if not unique, notwithstanding the contributions that some churches and clergy made to peacemaking during the Troubles. But despite their divisive past, the churches are, after all, among Ireland's few long-standing all-island institutions. So Protestants belong to Irish churches, after all, not British churches. And in recent years, there have been unprecedented levels of collaboration at the denominational church leaders level on issues like preparing for Brexit and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Conservative Catholics and Protestants have even made common cause on opposing abortion legislation in both jurisdictions. I've even heard Catholic priests sort of urging their parishioners to vote for the DUP because it stands on abortion. At the same time, however, there is scant evidence of an ecumenical, overarching kind of Irish Christian identity that encompasses Catholic and Protestant traditions developing at the grassroots level in Northern Ireland, and in that way, encouraging Protestants to embrace Irishness as part of their identity. But with the historical fear of the Catholic Church, now I think pretty comprehensively removed from unionist consciousness, I don't think the development of an Irish Christian identity like that is entirely out of the question, even in Northern Ireland. One recent example of this sort of potential unity is the Irish Blessing video, which is a pretty thoroughly cross-border, ecumenical, and multiracial project in which Irish Christians from a range of traditions sing "Be Thou My Vision" as a tribute to those who kept society together or are keeping society together during the pandemic. It features both Irish dancing and lambeg drumming. So it was released on YouTube on Pentecost Sunday this year and is approaching 1 million views. So I think the churches have an opportunity to witness to the fact that the pandemic could be teaching us that across the island, we're all in this together and we need to work together. But the church's effectiveness in doing that is as yet pretty untested. And the secularization that has helped remove some unionist fear of the Catholic Church also hinders their ability to have that significant societal impact. So my third and final point then is about Northern Irish identity, which on the surface seems like an inclusive identity for both Irishness and Britishness, perhaps. And over the last few years, depending on the poll that you look at, 20 to 25% of people identify as Northern Irish. Young Protestants and people who identify as no religion or other religions are more likely to choose Northern Irish identity than any other groups. And those who identify as no religion are more likely to come from Protestant backgrounds than Catholic backgrounds as well. So you could ask, are these trends signs that younger Protestants and non-religious people from Protestant backgrounds are more open to some sort of Irishness? This may very well be the case for some people, but as always, survey data should be interpreted cautiously because surveys, by their very nature, don't give people a chance to explain what they mean by Northern Irish. At the same time, the 2018 Northern Ireland Life and Times survey found that 50% of the population were describing themselves as neither unionist or nationalist. This was a historic high, rising from 33% in 1998. And women, people under 45, and people of no religion were most likely to identify as neither. The neither group did fall back down to 39% in the 2019 Life and Times, but it still remains a larger group than unionists at 33% and nationalists at 23%. So for me, this raises questions about how well represented a large kind of non-aligned group may feel in Northern Ireland where, because of the way the assembly is structured, the only identifications that really count are unionist and nationalist. So I think we should be asking quite fundamental questions about these structures and whether they're still fit for purpose, and what it means if a growing sort of swathe of Northern Ireland's population is unrepresented and therefore alienated and apathetic. We have a situation now where young people who are more likely to identify as neither, lack political representation, you could argue, are suffering the effects of intergenerational trauma due to previous generations' failures to deal with the past, and are being disproportionately disadvantaged educationally and economically by the pandemic. So I think we need to find ways for those young people to have a say in what their future looks like beyond the national question. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Gladys. Thanks for a fascinating talk. We're going to move straight to Christine now. So over to you, Christine.
Thanks. So I was going to talk a little bit at the beginning about the different ways in which I felt my identity pull me at over different periods of my life, and try to link that in to the ways in which I think that, even though that's very much just my experience, that there's sort of a constitutional underpinning for that. So on one side, I'm a product of a Southern Irish Protestant who's actually from the further north, in Donegal, which was my grandfather on my mother's side, who was a farmer from Raphoe area of Donegal, but became a Presbyterian minister and the minister of Fitzroy Presbyterian Church, which is now seen as a sort of very liberal church within an increasingly evangelically minded wider Presbyterian church. And in fact, of course, they were a pre-partition family who felt they'd been left on the wrong side of the border, but very quickly came to be comfortable with being Irish Protestants. Although interestingly, when my grandfather, moved and lived to work in the north, his first church was in a Hochel near Ballymena, and then in St Enoch's in North Belfast, and then Fitzroy for the rest of his life. He very much would have taken on, while being comfortable as an Irish Protestant, would have taken on a sense of being a part of the unionist community, although a minister in the Presbyterian Church of Ireland. So even within him, he, I think, had multiple different identities that shifted depending on which part of his life he talked about and who he was talking to. He was an ardent reader of the newsletter, but I found out in later life that was largely because many of his friends were dying, and it was actually the obituaries that he read, and he bought the newsletter to read the obituaries. So it's strange, our perceptions even of what people do, and actually when you find out why they do it, that was the one reliable place where friends and members of past congregations. Obituaries could be found and death notices. On my father's side, that there was a Brethren family, and at the extremities of Brethren and Plymouth Brethren, people believed that God put people in power and not elections and things, and even it's common for people not to vote because that was a sort of violation of God's order. So although that was an ardently unionist and at times branch of the family that had some commitment to sectarianism, then it was a kind of politically a complicated position and also quite a minority position in the north in a strange way among Protestantism. I suppose that on the two sides of my family, what we don't really talk about is there was a massive class divide. So my mother, who was the daughter of the manse, married my father, who was from the uniformed organisations, the BB, and come in much more from the hinterland of where the church was positioned. And they probably wouldn't have met anywhere else but in a Presbyterian church. My own identity was then informed by all of those things. My grandfather had a heart attack, retired from Fitzroy, which he found very stressful, and went back to work in Malin-on-Cardona, where I'm actually sitting at the minute. And so we very much grew up as part of the congregations of the Protestant congregations in Malin-on-Cardona, which were congregations that saw them, had a real empathy with Protestants in the north. And if they had to sort of express views on the north, which many would have been reluctant to do so, they would have been clear where they stood, but at the same time were strongly Irish, sang the Irish national anthem at all the church concerts, etc. So for me, that was a bit of an eye-opener, coming from really the cauldron that was in the Troubles in the 1970s to that. A really strong part of our cultural identity was Scottish. My mum did Scottish dancing, we did Scottish dancing. And in 2011, I moved from the north to Edinburgh, which is where I live and work now. And that was really interesting because I got my job in March 2011 and I didn't take it up to August. And between getting one as a professor of constitutional law in Edinburgh, which is kind of like a key Scottish constitutional law legal position, the SNP had won a massive unpredicted victory and put having a referendum on Scottish independence number one on the agenda. So actually I was plunged right in the middle of a massive campaign and feeling that I didn't have a dog in that race because I'd just arrived and didn't feel I had a right to a view almost. But I think as a political force, I'd always been in ways an admirer of the SNP. They just seemed competent in government, and in fact most people in Scotland that voted them into that majority didn't agree with independence of Scotland but did find them competent in governance, and that's where they were voted in. I saw really what I think in my lifetime, much more than even the peace process, was a really genuine democratic mobilisation across the whole of Scottish society, both for and against independence in that campaign, but the strength of people who were dispossessed, who had not traditionally voted SNP, and in particular, interestingly, that was Irish Catholic, historically Irish Catholic communities in Glasgow that had been ardent Labour voters, crucially switched in that campaign, which had two consequences. First of all, it brought the referendum to the brink of being won, and secondly, it finished Labour forevermore in Scotland. Forevermore, I don't think is too strong, by the way. And that has had huge consequences for the British electoral position and the Brexit positions and the government we find ourselves in today with the UK. So for me, being in Scotland has been really interesting because having always understood that as part of my heritage, and perhaps one that I was more sympathetic to than any sense of Britishness, to which to me was a very amorphous, vague identity that no one else in Britain really had, and not in the way that people from Protestants from the north had it. So I found I couldn't relate to it. And I mean, even constitutionally, Northern Ireland's not in Britain, it's in the United Kingdom. So it seems really odd that Northern Irish people constitutionally are very much akin to fond of being British. But my Scottishness, I think, was then in this cauldron of independence. And I also saw that Scotland's, in a way, for me, Northern Ireland through the looking glass, because there's things that just work a different way there. So the Presbyterian Church is really the Church of Scotland, is the mother church, and that's the established church in Scotland, whereas it was traditionally Church of Ireland. So they're all family. For example, it's very tied up with Church of Scotland and not the Episcopalian Church, as you would expect. The Highlands and Islands, that are the most Gaelic culture, are very Protestant, and that's where the Free Presbyterian Church, it's a different Free Presbyterian Church from Paisley's Church, but theologically it would have similarities. It's strongest in the most Gaelic-speaking areas of the country. And indeed, if the SNP was seen to have a sectarian hue, it would have been a Protestant sectarian hue. Now, it worked really, really hard before the referendum and during the referendum to promote a different idea of nationalism from cultural nationalism. And it's one that I think we could take from in this debate and in Northern Ireland, which is the idea of civic nationalism. So nationalism not as an ethnic identity or an ethnic signifier, not as something that tells you what religion somebody is, not as something for white people who think they were born there forever and ever, and that's what makes them Scottish, but as a political identity that can be adopted or left down at will, and that defines a political population rather than an ethnic one. That was really important in Scotland, I think, for the SNP, because they understand that if they rely on people who view themselves as, Scottish from the year dot, that's 30% of people will vote independence. If the case for independence in Scotland is to be won, they have to persuade people that are not traditionally from pro-independence communities or viewing themselves as sort of indigenously Scottish in some way to vote for independence. And that requires constructing a very different sort of nationalism. Interestingly, that's been really successful. For example, ethnic minority communities in Britain, by and large, don't relate to the term Englishness in England, but do relate to Britishness. But in Scotland, they much more relate to Scottishness than Britishness, and some of the key members of the government in Scotland and of the independence campaign were actually from Asian minority communities. So again, it was really interesting seeing the independence referendum in Scotland, seeing families which had husband and wives on different sides of the debate, and actually couples didn't get divorced. They managed to, it wasn't easy, but they navigated it. Different generations having different positions. And also actually even groupings within Labour Party, less so conservative, having pro and anti-independence stances that cut across other types of political complexion. For me, where does that leave me? I'm not sure. I think one other startling thing has happened to me in recent years, that although probably out of all the identities on offer to me, the one British was the one that least seemed to have something I could personally latch onto. That while I have seen the breakup very up close and personal, because actually I have a research project on international matters, which receives funding from Department of International Development within the UK government. So I'm in London a lot and watching, I suppose, the disintegration of the UK through the Brexit debate, that I can see something really important in Britishness being lost, and realise that maybe even within me I had a sneaking regard for that Britishness more than I realised. So there is a Britishness which is about internationalism. There's a Britishness that's about a quiet toleration for difference and acceptance of difference and forms of group accommodation. There's always been a room within Britishness for British Muslims, British Sikhs, in a way that, for example, French constitutional culture has very much promoted an idea of homogeneity and of people having to leave behind identities to move into them. I think there is a strand of Britishness that's about liberalism. And there's a strand of Britishness that then lives very comfortably constitutionally with robust forms of devolution that enabled acceptance of the type of innovative framework of the Belfast Agreement. What I see now is that has been replaced with something that's really a form of English nationalism. And that English nationalism is running up. And I see it almost more clearly in Scotland because I'm sitting there at the minute. It's running up against the devolution frameworks in ways that really ride a coach and courses through them. And of course, we see that with Brexit. The final thing I would say is that, and this is just maybe relating to what Grace has said, for me then, coming from my Presbyterian background, there's also been a tension within Presbyterianism that is often assumed to be the tension between being more liberal and ecumenical versus being less so. And it's been reflected in a form of power sharing in the Presbyterian Church, whereby the moderator, for example, changes almost every year. The moderator is for those who don't know the structures, is elected anew every year. But there's been a convention that a more liberal-minded moderator and from the more conservative wing rotate each year. This is not arranged by any mechanism. It just happens, more or less. But I do see a move within the church that was exemplified in the last couple of General Assemblies, whereby a different type of evangelicalism that's much more modelled on the states, which wasn't so much a thing in the Presbyterian Church, is coming to the fore. Ironically, this has led them to sever their links with the Church of Scotland, which was the mothership. But interestingly, at that point, they said, well, we have to take a different stance as regards the Catholic Church because of the reconciliation imperative in the North. So it's interesting to me that the traditional link with Church of Scotland was severed, but the idea that ecumenism and the need for good relations overrode the evangelical bent that severed the relationship with Scotland stayed to the fore. So I suppose that maybe if there's a positive thing to say in conclusion, it's that I see identities as relational. I think our identities are about how we position ourselves in relation to other people, and therefore they change. A bit the way I said my grandfathers did. It depends who we're talking to and what we're talking about, how we sort of see and understand the identity that we're engaging with. I think we navigate our own identities over a lifetime. And I think also the way in which we talk about forms of nationalism are very different. I think a nationalism can be civic and political. It can be ethnic. It can be a different word for being a certain religion. Those are all really different things. And in some of them, there are projects of coming together and transcending. And in others, there are projects of division. So these differences that we sort of elide over by words like nationalism become quite important in practice.
So thank you. Thank you very much. My job now is to start to ask questions, but Gladys, if you would like to ask Christine questions, or Christine, if you want to ask Gladys questions, please go ahead.
Could I actually come in with a little bit about Presbyterianism and Fitzroy? I suppose I should make a confession. I mean, you can probably tell from my accent, I was not born on this island, but I am a churchgoer and I go to Fitzroy. So there you go. And I was just struck by Christine's description of Fitzroy as liberal, which I mean, I think from the outside looking in within Presbyterianism, it probably does look like that. But I think that description and what I'm going to say now maybe offers a way into other avenues of conversation. I mean, I'm sure there are people in Fitzroy that would describe themselves as liberal, but I don't actually think that is how the congregation sees itself. I mean, I think the congregation sees itself as a place where people with diverse views, and that would include evangelicalism and conservative evangelical views on some issue, can sort of be together in a space constructively and find commonalities and so forth. And I mean, I think that's slightly different from liberalism. And I think it's similar to that, that traditional ideal of Presbyterianism, where the liberal and the conservative can, I suppose, constructively dialogue and bump along with each other under a kind of overarching umbrella. So I sort of wanted to throw that into the conversation after listening to Christine's remarks as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that about Fitzroy. And I think it's liberalism in a very Northern Ireland sense anyway, which is that actually at some level, even within that spectrum of views, people would be, broadly speaking, evangelical if they were anywhere else in the world. And in fact, when I said that the moderators of the Presbyterian Church switched, it was really, it's really been, I think, about whether there's a kind of more open or closed view in terms of issues like ecumenical dimensions and or not. So, I think the term sort of liberal and in Northern Ireland kind of means slightly different things than they do elsewhere. I now am at a Episcopalian church in Scotland, and it's liberal in a totally different way. I suppose I just was interested then from Grace around just whether you had a different understanding of why that sort of more religious shift or more sort of what I called a North American shift took place within the Presbyterian Church, because in some ways that ran a little bit sort of, you were kind of giving an analysis around the national issues, but it seemed to me there was a different type of shift going on within the Presbyterian Church that would have consequences, but not necessarily predictable ones, for things like Irish identity.
So do you mean, I suppose, the influence of North American evangelicalism on...
Well, I'm ascribing it to that, but I'm really talking about the break with the Church of Scotland, sort of over things like gay marriage, etc. Again, like just looking at how, without getting into the minutiae of it, looking at how that happened, it seemed to me there was sort of quite a clear push from within elements in the church to kind of adopt a kind of very strict reading of the Bible and a kind of try to push a sort of less sort of let's all live together in a broad alliance, and more a kind of you have one view and you're in or you're out. To me, that was quite a new thing actually within the Presbyterian Church as a broad church, which I think even in its conservative and liberal dimensions, to use those terms, there was always an acceptance that we can all rub along together. I felt that shifted in the last couple of years, particularly around that Church of Scotland decision. And I just wondered, is that type of shift that's, I think, much more around evangelical liberal divisions rather than sort of stance on Irishness or not, whether it have consequences for these other political issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically there's always been, liberal and conservative within Protestantism, within Presbyterianism more broadly. There's the old light, new light going back in the Ray Davy heresy trial, so it's got a historical legacy. Whether or not this is something new and decisive, it may be a bit too early to tell. I mean, what you're describing there is certainly a trend towards, I suppose, an assertive conservatism within the Presbyterian Church, but it's not the totality of the church. There is still a wing that doesn't necessarily agree with the steps that have been taken. But I suppose some of the interesting fallout from this for the Presbyterian Church in Ireland is the links with Queen's University are beginning to be severed. And as far as I understand it, Union College is going to align with St. Mary's London, which has a Catholic heritage and a Catholic ethos and so forth. So, in previous centuries, that would have been strange bedfellows. But you can see, I suppose, in a context where maybe all the churches feel a bit threatened by increasing secularization, the kind of alliances between Catholic and Protestant may I suppose, happen in unexpected ways. And, what that might mean down the road for questions of Irishness or Irish identity, remains open, I suppose.
Gladys, I have a question for you. And it has to do with your first point about Protestants that you meet or Presbyterians you meet, saying that, the IRA has got away with murder. We can't identify with Irish because of the violence. And my question is this. I understand why this might make them not like Sinn Féin, for better or worse. But given that Micheál Martin and Leo Varadkar and Fintan O'Toole and almost anybody in the main parties in the South, the traditional parties in the South, have the same view, why can Protestants in the North or Presbyterians in the North not identify with Micheál Martin, for example, even if they can't identify with Sinn Féin?
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid question. I mean, I think part of it is bound up in the idea that, if there's a united Ireland, Sinn Féin wins. So, it's that old zero-sum thing. So to identify as Irish, to agree that a united Ireland might be a good idea or might be constructive or productive, it's given up something in the zero-sum game. And a zero-sum game where you maybe have lost personally someone very close to you. So even though, the Irish politicians you've named are quite anti-Sinn Féin, as you rightly point out, I think that is still maybe an element of it for some people.
Okay, what then? I mean, if Irish is just negative, what's the positive aspect of Britishness? What's the concept of being British that the people you talk to have?
Well, and I mean, a lot of my research, my personal research, I don't actually delve in too deeply to interrogate the content of a British identity. A lot of my stuff is much more looking at religious aspects, but I have, other scholars and so forth that have looked a bit more deeply at the Britishness. They find that it is maybe not, I don't know if I hesitate to say deep, but I mean, the content isn't that substantial, and there's that old idea of the conditional loyalty as well, that the aspects of identity that people really hook onto, it's more to do with, some of the, maybe perhaps even some of the Scottish aspects of identity that Christine was talking about earlier. It's to do with a heritage of the religion and Ulster Scots and stuff, the kind of what you might expect of a sort of a Britishness, it's maybe thin is the word to describe it, I think. Now, that might not be the case for all people, but I think there's a conditionality to Britishness, and it's some of the main elements of, that go into it draw more on a type of a Scottish tradition. Now, of course, that's not entirely true, because obviously not everyone who identifies here as unionist comes from a Scottish or a Presbyterian background, but that would be, I suppose, my sense.
See, I wonder, and maybe Christine has something to say about this, if being British isn't equivalent to being Irish. Being Irish is a sort of national stroke, territorial stroke, peoplehood type thing. Being British is much more directed towards a state and that state's wider influence through the world, whether it's imperial or whether it's today a more general Commonwealth type British world. But that's not the same sort of thing as being Irish. It might not even be the same sort of thing as being Scottish.
Yeah, so being British, I think the fact that different communities within Britain are British in really different ways, I think it is a different sort of identity, and it has its own history. The only thing I think, I would agree that it is thin, but the one thing I would think challenges that for me a bit is, I remember talking to a very good friend in Scotland, actually a colleague in the university, who I think would have been assumed from the outside to be because he was very Scottish and very much immersed in teaching the Scottish legal system, would have been assumed to probably be a natural independence voter. And in fact, was much more a sort of Labour pro-union person when it came to the yes or no vote. while dismissing some of the silly sort of unionist arguments. And, when we were talking about what our views were shaped, he just said, well, I just view the UK as, for me, the relevant political community. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, just, I believe in pooling and sharing of resources, but also just for me, that is the relevant political community. And I was thinking that I think that describes a lot of the unionist perspective of Britishness, that it's not necessarily thin, and it's not necessarily an identity like Irish, but actually that doesn't mean it's not really significant, right? Because we don't almost choose what we view as the political community that we relate to. So I think if I talked to people in my family and they were just to tell me why they were British, it would be things like, I like watching the British TV, the British news. I see that as sort of relevant in my life. I relate to British politics and structures, and I don't really relate to the Fianna Fáil Fine Gael division. My relatives will understand it to lesser or more extensive, but they don't really see it as kind of pulling them into a particular place within that framework. Maybe some of this is just what you know, and if our news switched tomorrow, different things would seem relevant if the border switched, and I've no doubt people would adjust and find new ways to assert themselves. But I think if you're asking people now, then they're saying, well, I can't pin it down to one or two things, but for me, it's actually not really about culture and those things, and that doesn't make it thin. It's just a way of saying that this, for me, is my relevant political community. It's within a UK framework, and it's within that way of seeing things, and I almost don't know how to take it into another framework unless I was asked to be there. And I think I've probably been too dismissive of that element of it. And I think that's quite deep and quite significant. And that's the element that I think came to the fore in people that weren't big unionist in the Scottish independence debate. They were just saying, well, this is just a matter of where our gut lies in terms of what we see as the constituency of we're a part. And we see it as a UK-wide framework rather than a Scotland alone framework. And we can sort of have both Scottish and British identity. And those were people that actually would, for the most part, identify very strongly as Scottish rather than British.
On that point, that gets us to Gladys's neither nors. The people that say they're not unionist or not nationalist, they're neither. And I'd been thinking when Gladys was talking, lots of these neithers actually support the union. Lots of them kind of think, as you're saying, unproblematically within the context of British sovereignty, of the UK as the political community. And so I wonder, Gladys, is too much being made of these neither nors? Are they really so disengaged? I mean, years ago, people used to say, well, I'm not a unionist. I'm not an ist of any form. I happen to support the union. I happen to watch BBC. I happen to think of myself probably as British, etc., etc. So I'm just wondering if this 50% of neither nors, neither unionist nor nationalist, actually says as much as maybe you're suggesting. Maybe they're not so disengaged. Maybe they're simply saying, well, we're not politicised. Ours is a banal acceptance of the British context.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's worth mentioning there as well, this banal acceptance of the British context, that includes a lot of people of Catholic and nationalist background as well. I mean, we know for years, and perhaps this is changing somewhat, that nationalists, if there had been a border poll, a lot of them would vote to remain in the United Kingdom, even though, identifying with Irishness very strongly. So I think that's another element to add into the mix there. In terms of whether we're making too much of the neither nors as an alternative group, I mean, I think the problem is that there is some evidence that people who identify that way are less likely to vote and to participate in politics that way. So there's a sense, I think, that they would feel, probably disenfranchised by the type of system that we have set up in Stormont, where, you go and you designate unionist or nationalist, and pretty much if, your vote doesn't count unless you've got that designation. So it's, in a sense, they're almost disenfranchised and disincentivized to participate politically. So, I mean, I don't think it's making too much of them in terms of, say, your point is right, that there probably is a banal acceptance of remaining in the union. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think that, they might be interested in issues beyond the national question, things like, better healthcare, better education system, those bread and butter issues. And our political system pretty much allows us to ignore those bread and butter issues to a certain extent, because everything tends to get reduced and sucked into the issues that really polarize. So in a sense, a large swathe of the population feeling disenfranchised, even if they do want to remain in the union, I don't think that that's a positive thing to say the least. Yeah.
I have another question for both of you. Is this banal sense of being British, this sort of acceptance of a British context for many unionist Protestants, and indeed others as well, is that different east of the Ban and west of the Ban? And I'm asking because I'm from west of the Ban, and I actually think it is. But I wondered what you thought, whether that's...
Christine, do you want to take that one first?
Well, I lived in Derry for a lot of years. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, actually. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear why you think, Jennifer, that it is different, or what basis you have for that.
I think at the moment, Protestants west of the Ban have got used to being a minority, much more than they used to be. And so there's a different... it isn't that they want a united Ireland, or that they don't want the union, but the banalness of the union is a bit more questioned. There's a bit more, well, what would it be like, and why don't I want it? As opposed to simply assuming that it's there, and anybody that questions it must be bad.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose I questioned overall whether the banalness was really banalness, because I think it is a bit less banal than I might have said it. And I think that idea of relevant political community is a bit more than just, well, I'm used to the status quo. I think one thing is true probably west of the Ban, which is, I think there is, I think like the opening up of the border through the agreement and on has been a good thing. And I think I don't know if I could really generalize, but certainly from people I know, the idea that Brexit may reinstitutionalize a border of some sort is seen as an unacceptable consequence among Protestant communities. And I think, it's just partly that period was really negative. This has been the thing that was kind of resolved really quietly by the agreement and almost uncontroversially, the openness of the border, and that people sort of can see that openness also keeps them in a funny way secure in Northern Ireland, because it sort of lowers the ante for uniting it. So I do know some people from the Protestant community who voted for Brexit as a sort of protest vote that feel that the consequences of reinstitutionalizing a border would be really negative, and that would actually push them more towards a almost united Ireland position, although maybe not that far. So maybe for me, that maybe is his main difference, rather than a shift in identity or an acceptance of a minority community position, that actually now that things are potentially shifting over the border, that there's really a feeling of not going back on that issue, just as much as sort of other things stay in play.
Yeah, I would want to add to that, and this maybe complicates things a bit, but certainly we know, during the Troubles, the borders were areas of, intense violence, and particularly in some small border communities and so forth. Quite often people on both sides feel they know who carried out certain acts and so forth. So I think in border areas as well, you need to be, I think you need to be mindful of that and need to recognize it, that there is probably a lot of unresolved pain and trauma, from that legacy of violence, which, was concentrated in some border areas. And I mean, Jennifer, I think you've actually done a bit of research recently that may be behind your question. So I don't know if it's okay for me to break protocol and ask the chair a question, if you had any insight into that, and whether, that legacy of violence is also something that comes into the mix.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to mention the legacy of violence. And I didn't do the search in actual border areas where you get small communities that are highly, sense themselves as having been victims and so on. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Gladys, I kind of agree with you. We have about 3 minutes left. So if either of you would like to ask each other a question or make a point.
I had one thing. I don't know if, Gladys, you came across it in your research, but it's always intrigued me. One thing I've really seen an unevenness in Protestant and Catholic communities has been, I suppose, in attitudes to sort of cross-community work. So it always struck me, as somebody who engaged in that sort of in early teenage years, very much from the Protestant side, that there was a huge curiosity and wish to engage from Catholics, but that Protestants didn't feel that need to engage in the same way, not out of a sectarianism, but really out of we're kind of fine the way we are, and we're within our own community and it's all fine, which maybe was just a different perspective. But I just wondered, did you come across that? Do you think that's changing? Because I think we were asking, were British and Irishness the same? And I think they're not. But it also seemed to me that ideas to the other are really different within the two communities.
I mean, I think you're onto something there. I mean, what you're describing, I suppose, is a sort of an indifference maybe on the Protestant side and an interest on the Catholic side. And to me, that sounds like maybe, within the wider communities. And as you probably gather, a lot of my research has been, based within churches, within faith-based communities. So I can speak more to that context. And I think it might be slightly different in some of those faith-based communities, although that is changing. And I think a lot of that has to do, there's a legacy within Protestantism in Northern Ireland of anti-ecumenism. I mean, I don't think there's a better word for it. But again, if we bring up Ian Paisley again, he got his career started as an anti-ecumenical protester, really because the fear that he articulated was that the ecumenical movement would gather everybody into one big church and Protestants' religion and civil liberties would be squashed and so forth. So there is a strong strand of anti-ecumenism within Protestantism. So even today, people who in any other place on earth, would probably describe themselves as ecumenical Protestants will not use the term ecumenical, because it has been I suppose, devalued in our particular context. So I think within church-going Protestants, if that's the right word, there's a certain constituency that I suppose is opposed to engagement with Catholics on theological grounds out of fear of ecumenism. And that can translate into hostility. I mean, I don't think that's as great as it was, 15, 20 years ago, but it's still there to a certain extent. And I think what you get now on the flip side within Catholicism, perhaps maybe it's more of a similar indifference, when I think of, church activism and whether churches, both Catholic and Protestant, can make a contribution. I think the two main enemies, if that were for the churches making a contribution, are hostility and indifference and apathy. And, we may get to a point where apathy and indifference are the greater threat than hostility.
I think we have to stop now. So thank you both very much. There's loads more to talk about and hopefully people will be able to talk about it. But thank you both. And
thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for doing such a great job in Zoom and complicated circumstances. Thank you.
And thanks to Bill Golston and everybody who helped organise this.